over Good Friday. And if you've made travel plans, here's wishing you safe travels. Well, the COVID pandemic has definitely affected us in many ways, but we are on the road to recovery. And that's what today's topic is all about. So without further delay, let's dive into the session. Good afternoon and welcome to our Brown Bag series, brought to you by HeadHunt in partnership with Ngee Academy. My name is Tammy. Broadcasting live, we have with us Professor Shandre Mugan Thangavelu from the University of Adelaide. He'll be presenting on the topic of pandemic recovery in East Asia and ASEAN. Before I hand over the time to Prof, please note that there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to type in your questions at any time during the presentation. Please also note that we will be conducting our feedback poll at the end of the session, so please stay with us throughout. Without further delay, I will now pass the time to Prof. Shandre. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you, Tammy. Good afternoon to everyone from Singapore. My name is Shandre, and I'm going to talk on the pandemic and the recovery. And I'm supposed to tell a story. They asked me to tell a story, so I will try to tell a very consistent story. And I will talk about the pandemic recovery and also the pandemic policy itself, how policymakers are designing policies for the recovery. So fairly, I need to set up a narrative in terms of how I want to do the presentation. So I will start with the overview of putting out some stylized facts about the COVID-19 pandemic, which is very different from a lot of other economic shocks. This is purely a pandemic shock that has a lot of heavy disruptions and very devastating impact on many countries, globally, in fact. And any virus that is global nature is called a pandemic. But we are moving to a stage of recovery. I will start with the recovery first, and then start talking about how are we designing the policy. And then I will talk about the impact of pandemic shock, how deep and how wide the pandemic shock has been. We need to touch a little bit on the global value chain resilience, which is quite important because that is related to the inflation and also to the recovery process on top of the Russia-Ukraine war that is exacerbated the supply chain effects as well as the inflation itself. And then I will finish off with the challenges of the recovery itself. So let me set out at the outset what our focus is so that we know there will be a recovery. The question is what type of recovery, and there are different types of recovery. So it can be a U-shaped recovery, it can be a V-shaped or even a K-shaped recovery, which means that some countries is going to pick up, some countries will actually stagnate. Fairly, the forecast by ADB last year, end of last year, was that we will see a strong recovery in most of the countries. And in fact, during the pandemic, there's only one country that was showing positive growth, that is China. China was showing quite a bit of resilience. And as you can see, the growth of China was fairly stable when all the other countries went into a recession. And the forecast for 2022 is that we will grow, but fairly we expected China to grow a bit stronger, but fairly it will land around 5.5. But this forecast will be updated again in the middle of the year. And most countries are going to show positive component, and some countries will level a little bit down, like Malaysia is going to level up, and Singapore is going to land around 4% or slightly above 4%. Thailand is going to level down to 3.9, and Vietnam is also going to level down from 7 to 6.5. So fairly, what we expect is a V-shaped recovery. V-shaped recovery means fairly, we expect the pandemic goes down, and then fairly we should able to get back to the maybe the pre-pandemic level by end of this year, early next year. We might experience a U-shaped recovery. That means we go down and stay for a while. And this is dependent on the other impact of the Russia-Ukraine war that is giving us a lot of disruption in the value chain, and also affecting the oil prices and the inflation itself. So, but at the moment, we are looking at a V-shaped output recovery. But output recovery doesn't mean that we're going to see an employment recovery. So we are closely monitoring whether we're going to see an employment recovery, whether it's going to be a jobless recovery or job full recovery. And I'll explain why. We might be expecting a jobless recovery, which basically means that we're going to see growth, but you're not going to see a lot of jobs being created. Maybe the jobs will be more skilled, semi-skilled. Automation is going to hit us, digitalization is going to hit us, and that will change the creative destruction, not only at the industry level, but the creative destruction at the occupational level, which will have a lot of social impact on most of the ASEAN countries, including Singapore. Let me start my narrative by talking a little bit about before COVID. And that will put into perspective the impact of COVID itself. So before COVID, we're already experiencing a lot of anti-globalization issues, a lot of issues against trade, protectionism was rising. And fairly, we observed that US-China trade war, and with Trump coming into office, and then moving away from open regionalism to more strategic trade, which actually means trying to put in inward-looking, more protectionist policies start coming in. We were still shifting away a little bit from the rule-based trading activities. On top of that, we saw rising inequality between countries, within countries, and this is reflected by the wage gap between the skilled and the unskilled. The middle jobs were disappearing in Western countries, European countries. And we also experienced the disappearing of the middle skill jobs. Mostly white collar jobs were disappearing as technology created this polarization of skills. And which basically means that a lot of white collar jobs, secretarial jobs, accounting jobs were polarized to the skill, and fairly we need essential workers. So fairly some of the unskilled jobs still remain, but fairly the middle was taken over by artificial intelligence, digitalization, technology. And within this framework of high growth in and openness, we also observe working poor. A lot of people are working, but they are poor. But they were not in poverty, but they are basically below the poverty line. You also observe middle income trap, not only in terms of occupation, but also by country. So middle income trap definition is countries that go into the middle income definition will find it hard to graduate out of the middle income to upper middle income or even higher developed country status. Malaysia, Thailand, and to some extent, we're discussing about the rebalancing of China, and China might be trapped. We were experiencing a lot of outsourcing, fragmentation, and I will discuss a little bit on the global production value chain. So as we design policies, we look at how the global trade and global production has been arranged. And global production value chain is the concept that defines how the regional and global trading and production framework has been realigned. And this global GVC framework, it's not managed by government, it's purely managed by multinationals, and that term we coined that as the governance of GVC. At the same time, I will discuss a little bit about the GVC resilient, how the governance of the GVC, that is multinationals, how they move their production horizontally and vertically to absorb and mitigate economic shocks. I will give special reference to some of them. There is also a term called aging and demographic dividend. I will not talk about the demographic dividend. We also observe consumer patterns were shifting, e-commerce was setting in, and the wealth is shifted towards the older workers, and they tend to be the key component in the wealth management. Whereas consumers, younger ones, were impulsively consuming through internet and so on and so forth. So the digital e-commerce was transforming, telecommunication technologies and connectivity was accelerating. And we were discussing about climate change, but it never took a serious shape until the COVID. We realized that not just climate change, but talking about overall the health of the planet and sustainable development issues become very important for us. There was also some narrative about inclusive growth. Social entrepreneurship were picking up, like the Gojeks in Indonesia, where the guys in the motorbike were driving around and picking up people and solving some of the congestion issue in Jakarta. So social entrepreneurship were picking up due to digitalization, solving a lot of social issues. So that was, again, an important issue that digitalization actually provided us, where SMEs are able to participate. The entry cost into certain activities were lowered because of technology itself. We also moved from skills development to doing different tasks. And this is called the third stage unbundling of skills, where individuals start unbundling their skill sets. So the second stage unbundling is called the unbundling of production process through division of labor. The third stage is unbundling of skills based on task. Singapore is already at the third stage unbundling, which basically means that how to train people, how to retain people, how to make workers relevant in the labor market become important. And so the government has moved into a concept called future skills, how to think about future skills and future skills development. So some stylized facts about the virus. The virus, this virus, it's COVID-19 virus, is highly a contagious virus. It's different from SARS. SARS is a deadly but less contagious. So I was talking to a doctor, and then his definition of a contagious virus is contagious virus. The way it survives, it will mutate faster and faster. That's the idea of it being contagious. So it gets to a large number of people. The survival of virus is based on the mutation of the virus. Whereas SARS is a deadly virus, so its ability to mutate is less, but it can, once you get it, your chance of survival is quite low. But the difference between them is what we call asymptomatic nature. So a contagious virus like COVID-19, that you can carry the virus, but we cannot observe that you have a virus through thermal cameras and so on. Because SARS is a more deadly, so your body reacts with a temperature pretty fast. Whereas the COVID, it takes time for your body to react, because by then you already spread to a large number of people, which we call the community spread. Because of these unobservables, policies become very difficult to design because we do not know who has it and who do not have it. So in that case, the only policy instrument we had was lockdown, border lockdowns, and close down of activities to contain the virus itself. And in that case, there will be overreaction, there will be policy risk, and sometimes what we call policy overshooting occurs. That means we couldn't find the equilibrium. So fairly, we put in measures that are higher than what the actual equilibrium is. In that case, lockdowns and border closures. And the outcome you're looking at was fatality rate, to reduce the fatality rate. So this virus has been contagious. It spreads over a large number of people, then the number of fatality increase. That is the way this virus actually functions. Only characteristic of this virus is the movement of people. As long as people are moving and it spreads, and we can't observe that, who has it, who doesn't have, and policy design become very difficult. And fairly, most of our policies, in fact, 90% of our policies are all based on the market. So we need to close the market, and policy become a paralysis. That means we can't use any of the market-based policies, tax, incentive mechanisms. Those things break down completely. So fairly, without the market, we cannot support public goods. So what is public goods? Public goods are goods that generally everybody can have that good. Whereas private goods, you have a price. So you pay a price, and then it excludes some people from consuming that good. So a public good, since it's have to be consumed by a large number of people, a private sector will never account or internalize public goods into their profit-making decisions. So we put out a mechanism where we tax them, direct, indirect tax, and then we support public policy itself, public goods. But the COVID has completely overturned this, which means that when we close all the borders and all economic activities, market actually collapse. When market collapse, we still need to support public goods, and then we need to put in relief packages. So far, we have not seriously put in much fiscal policy, fiscal measures yet. Those are slowly coming in, but most of the time, policies are more for relief component, and then trying to open up the market itself. So in most of the cases, when you have public goods, when we think about public goods, it become more inward looking and rather than outward looking. So when we talk about the market-based activities are more outward looking. So when in terms of inward looking dimension that public goods bring us, basically we need policy coordination. Policy coordination is not just within the private sector and the public sector, but also across institutions within a country, and institutions across countries become very important for us. So economic cooperation, not only at the regional level, economic cooperation at the global level is required to actually internalize the public good decisions into the private sector decisions. And that is, again, the other challenge we have, and I will discuss this later. So COVID is not observable and persistent. The persistent component comes in with the mutation itself, and the virus start having different variants. And so initially, when we thought we observed the COVID-19, we thought it's a very temporary shock. And so fairly, we put in a lot of relief packages to keep develop some threshold for household to survive. But when the virus start mutating, and then the shock become more persistent. Persistent means it's every pandemic cycle. We thought that's only one tip in the pandemic cycle. Then we realized that multimodal distribution, which means that not only each virus variant peaks, and then when the variant dies, and then the mutation takes place, and then we see another peak. That is what we call persistent. So when we have a virus that's persistent, and then also not observable, the policy risk become higher. That means we open the border, And then we let businesses come in and we set up the red, green, blue lanes and so on. And then we close the border again because of the persistence. And each time the policies put in, those components become redundant when the persistent is not on the same virus, but a new virus itself. So the pandemic transmission mechanism is through people and movement of people, movement of goods and movement of people, and less on the movement of goods. And movement of people and movement of goods are not mutually exclusive, they interact. So basically, both these components are very important for trade and investment. And particularly, movement of people was very strong in the pre-pandemic period. With most of the technologies put in is to allow a massive number of people to move across the border. Budget airlines, budget hotels, all these technologies, or the A380 planes, all these are to move massive number of people across the border. So when the virus hit the movement of people, the movement of people industry collapsed completely. Tourism, aviation industries, and all those key industries that most SMEs rely on where a lot of semi-skilled and unskilled workers rely on, completely collapsed. And this devastating impact of movement of people industry was very apparent in developing countries themselves. And of course, movement of goods, we have technology. So we use digital technology, artificial intelligence, and so on to manage the movement of goods issue. So e-commerce, delivery system, food delivery system, technology came in to mitigate some of the movement of people issue. But some industries that are very important industries like tourism, hotels, restaurants, they completely collapse. And which means that if it's temporary nature, fairly policies are just to mitigate them. But if it's persistent in nature, then it will turn out to be a structural issue itself. Structural means a lot of people will be unemployed, the skills will disappear very fast, industries and SMEs will disappear. And that becomes an important component to think about the service linkages. Service linkages means moving goods from one place to the other also become an important dimension in terms of movement of people. The persistence of the shock actually increase the cost of moving goods across border and within border. That cost has increased very highly, and that give us a very strong negative impact when we saw the recovery itself. The pandemic is also not very symmetric, which means that pandemic impact is stronger on vulnerable population, older workers, also very heavy impact on poor people because they have less health condition. It's also heavy impact on rural sector than urban sector because urban sectors have, urban centers had the more infrastructure, health infrastructure to protect themselves, whereas the rural sector do not have the health infrastructure to protect themselves. And the other is pandemic also asymmetric across countries. So Singapore was using technology to manage movement of people, and Singapore has a little more reserve to actually mitigate the economic shock itself. And the other thing that become very important in the pandemic is food security and food supply chain. And that becomes important, whether we call this essential industry or essential workers. The lockdown has seriously affected the food supply chain and the food security issue itself. And this itself is becoming an important policy agenda and a social agenda at the ASEAN level. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the policy design in the pandemic recovery. So it's a pandemic, and how do we define a recovery in a pandemic? So fairly, when we think about recovery, fairly, when we make this forecast that Singapore is going to grow by more than 4% and so on, fairly, we need to identify the information set that we have and use the information set to make a projection. So when you have a lot of unobservables, then the margin of error will be very high. So when the margin of error is very high, fairly your forecast will hit the high threshold and the low threshold. So how do we minimize this threshold, and how do we minimize this error term? So at the same time, as I mentioned, the pandemic is not just an economic dimension. It has a lot of social implication itself. And I will talk about the social implication in terms of people's behavior. And people's behavior is very difficult to model in any recovery. The reason is different people have different behavior. Larger firms have different behavior than smaller firms. Older people have a different behavior in terms of the household dynamics and their work security issues. Younger people have a different behavior in terms of how they want to see the recovery. So because this pandemic overlaps a lot of social issues, the behavioral dimension also affects the forecast itself. The other dimension that is also equally important is the overlapping impact of multiple shocks. So as we move into the pandemic, we already observe the rebalancing of China and the US-China trade war. So fairly, the forecast that was made in 2020 and was based on the data that accounts for the US-China trade war. And on top of that, we had the pandemic impact. And now the uncertainty has also increased with the Russia-Ukraine war spilling over into the global value chain in Europe and increasing the resource costs from fertilizer to gas, oil, and driving another oil shock. So we are experiencing not only an economic shock, an oil shock, and a trade war, but also a pandemic. So there are multiple components coming into this when we start forecasting the recovery itself. But I will bring it down to pandemic and we focus on that, then we do the other comparative analysis. So the three components are important in this new normal: behavior of people. And behavior of people, of course, will be driven by technology and digitalization, people working from home, and even some people refuse to wear a mask. And so people's behavior, how they're going to manage the pandemic is going to be very important. Whether we see the pandemic as from a community point of view, which is the social dimension will come in, or we're going to see people's behavior from an individual point of view. Those things will come into the way we're going to think about the recovery. And economies that have more managed system tend to manage the pandemic better because they focus on the communal returns than the individual returns. Technologies, fairly, that will be important in the recovery. Digitalization will accelerate. Artificial intelligence will come in. We're going to see more robotics, more robots kicking in to mitigate the pandemic issue. That's a movement of people issue. So we're going to see a lot of driverless cars, electric cars. Those things will start coming in. The technological transformation in the next 10 years will be tremendous for us. The reason is not only the pandemic has increased the digitalization component, but the oil shock has given us another important reason to shift away from better managed system, renewable energies, and more green-based energies, which are more important for us. Alternative to oil becomes a very important innovation that's going to take place from cars to the way we're going to live, and urban centers will transform themselves. that acceleration will be very strong, particularly when the Cold War in Europe, driven by Russia and Ukraine war, will persist longer. Then we need to look for alternative energy. So now we are talking about even the viability of hydrogen and so on and so forth. Institutions have to be more forward-looking because if there's going to be a persistence of this shock, that means when virus mutates, fairly we need to forecast the future. And fairly our institutions should be more forward-looking rather than backward-looking. What is a backward-looking or forward-looking? A backward-looking means I'm just using the data or thinking about the behavior of people before the COVID. But institutions have to be more forward-looking, more dynamic, and able to fairly think about how people's behavior will change, how technology will change our behavior. And a good example is I'm giving a live lecture using the internet and reaching out to a large number of people. And those kind of technologies will hit us faster and faster. Human resource management will change. And we need to think about people working from home. Labor institutions have to adjust because people are working more than 8 hours a day. Our labor contract is only based on 8 hours a day. So institutions have to come in and change. And this is also going to be part of how we're going to read policy design in the pandemic recovery. So let me talk about how we are moving to opening up the border. And that policy design is very important for us to move to the next stage of institutional reform and then start thinking about technologies and so on. So let's start with how we are thinking of the virus. COVID-19 virus was asymptomatic. Only characteristic is movement of people. So we couldn't identify who has and who doesn't have. Fairly with WHO announcing that in early 2020 that we're having a pandemic, we close all the border and restrict the movement of people. And to contain the virus, because our outcome is fatality. Number of people are dying because our health infrastructure was not ready to manage that kind of a large infectious population. And at that time, we pushed the technology for testing. So we have the PCR test, antigen test, rapid test, saliva test. So all these tests, we pushed them as hard as possible because testing, lockdowns, and isolation become important policy dimension. But that has a lot of impact on the labor market because the labor market completely collapsed and the business activity completely collapsed. The level 2 is we push for vaccination. So vaccination is important because it gives us a level of protection. And if the vaccination level increases to a certain threshold, then individual protection is higher. Fairly, the base component for us for this contagious virus to spread from one person to the other can be mitigated. So the vaccination we push the vaccination very hard. And normally a vaccination that takes 5 to 6 years to be validated in the market and by health authorities to collapse that to 6 months. The institution worked so fast with the vaccination, and that was remarkable achievement for us. So the level 2 is the vaccination and increasing the level of protection. And the idea of that is to reduce the unobservables in the community and at the border, which actually means that we can increase labor mobility. So as our testing and the vaccination level increase, fairly labor mobility start moving. And because the unobservables become more observables for us. And with more observables, and then we have a better understanding of how the virus react, how people go into hospital, can we give a home therapy as opposed to hospitalization. Those kind of trade-offs become very visible for us to design our policies accordingly. Level 3 is very important for us, and that gives us another level of confidence called COVID-19 therapies. So we now have COVID pills that started from middle of 2022 and fairly by end of, middle of 2021, and then middle of 2021, and now we have a set of COVID pills from Pfizer to Moderna that allow us to have home treatment. So I can go for a 5-course. If I have a COVID, I stay at home, take the COVID pills, just like a flu virus, and then I recover. And fairly, the level 2 and level 3 give us a lot of certainty in terms of pandemic management, how we can manage the pandemic and shift it to an endemic. Endemic means the virus is and not at a global level, fairly trying to bring it down to a country level. And the level 4, I might call it level 0, is going to be very important for us. Building stronger healthcare institutions. As we start opening the border, this investment is going to be very critical to monitor, to identify, monitor, and implement drugs and vaccination. This is important to identify and monitor and implement the virus becomes important. And that's where we can manage the mutation of the virus itself. If we fail in level 4, then we will go back to square one. That means go back to level 1 or level 2, and then we need to think about how to at least maintain our level 2 status in terms of the pandemic management. So this is where the health scientists need to help us a lot. Most policymakers, although we understand viruses and especially now how the viruses spread and so on, but fairly the science of the virus, none of the policymakers know. So how to do the genome sequencing of the new virus, how to bring it to the market, what is the level of sequencing need to be done so that we can define this as a new variant. The science has to help. So policies, the science, policies, and pandemic management is all been overlapping quite significantly. So this level is going to be very critical for us to manage. If we can manage this, fairly whatever we put in terms of level 2, level 3, and testing fully will be intact, and we can give boosters, third booster, fourth booster, and then fairly manage the pandemic. But keep in mind, this COVID-19 virus is, I don't think so we will completely eliminate. It is a living organism that will stay with us, whether in our body or in the environment, and which basically means that we need a stronger regional global cooperation to manage such pandemic impacts in the future. So behavior will change, and that fairly, I think we are moving into a recovery process, because the way we had level 1, level 2, and fairly level 3, and then we keep giving the boosters, and that will keep the momentum and contain the contagious effect of COVID-19 virus. And behavioral component will change, as I mentioned, because the pandemic, which basically means that face-to-face costs of communication will go down significantly in the new normal. Basically, what is face-to-face cost? The cost of me coming to Zoom and just having a chat with someone in real time, the costs become very small. But that leads to a discussion of global value chain, which means that consumer to consumer activities will increase, consumer to business activity will increase, and consumer to the government activity will increase significantly. So social network, social policies, and that will become an important dimension in terms of how the new normal will be in terms of behavioral dimension, behavioral economics, and behavioral policies will be very center of how we're going to design policies. At the same time, digitalization will allow me to do multiple tasks at one time. And this is people with skills were able to do different things and are able to generate more wealth and income for themselves. Those without skill were likely to be marginalized in this kind of transformation itself. So we need to think how to keep them, retain them, and also retool them to be relevant to the labor market. We will also observe agglomeration. Agglomeration means industries will come together very closely. Communication technology will increase digitalization and artificial intelligence activities. Machine-to-machine communication will accelerate. Let me give you a good example of machine-to-machine communication. I'm wearing Apple Watch. I have my Apple phone, and whenever my phone rings, my watch actually rings. And I can talk with my phone, my watch to my phone. So that is what you call machine-to-machine communication. So 5G, new kind of technologies will increase driverless cars, machine-to-machine communication, will increase more robotic activities that will replace jobs, that will lead to a creative destruction of occupations. New kind of occupations will come. A lot of workers might be displaced themselves. Institutional reforms, mass vaccination, coordination of vaccination. Currently, most of the vaccinations are centered on developed countries and some aspect of developing countries. Vaccination are not reaching out to less developed countries. And that will be a critical challenge for us, how to make sure that all part of the world is protected from the vaccination, from the COVID itself, which means that it's a public good. Movement of people is important. So fairly protecting all aspects and all parts of the global economy will be very critical. And mass vaccination and reducing the price of vaccination and vaccination infrastructure is equally going to be important. It's not having the vaccination, but actually putting in a cold storage so that we can reach to poor people will be important. Digitalization means information flow, and that will be a new kind of institution will emerge. New normal of business facilitation, like digital and so on, will be important. Human capital resource management will be important. So these are all new dimensions appearing in the new normal. Okay, so fairly I discussed the pandemic, put in the pandemic policy. I think the recovery is intact, although what's happening in Shanghai is a case study. Fairly, I think we should be able to contain it. And because we have level 2 and level 3, and fairly worked very hard on level 4 to identify the virus in Shanghai. So as long as level 2 and level 3 is intact, we can give a booster and keep the borders open. And without the borders opening, most economies were at the verge of bankruptcy. So now with the Russia-Ukraine war and higher inflation, the economic shocks to us in terms of fiscal sustainability and fiscal issues, that means we are moving to a lot of budget deficits that will increase the vulnerability of most economies in the region itself. So again, the social impact is important, the interplay between a pandemic shock and economic shock. We are looking at it very carefully, where there are triggers really appearing that we might be getting closer to a financial crisis. And because a lot of banks have already been exposed to the Russian-Ukraine war and to Europe itself, which means that there will be another set of adjustment coming. So we need large fiscal reserves like Singapore. Singapore is lucky to have a fiscal reserve. From our forecast, if we keep level 2 and level 3 going, fairly, we see GDP is going to recover. But whether recovery is going to be a job-full or jobless recovery, we're still not sure, because if digitalization comes in, and already Trump talked about decoupling from East Asia Biden is also keeping that momentum of moving essential activities from East Asia to US and Europe, which means that the decoupling effects will be disruptive for us from the GVC point of view. And I will talk a little bit about labor movement industries themselves. So keep in mind, so far in US, we see some strong job growth. Whether that will be maintained or digitalization is going to kick in is going to be very interesting to see. I'm not going to discuss this. The only thing I want to talk about is the supply side was intact. Why? Because as opposed to an economic shock like Asian financial crisis, global financial crisis, it came through the market. So we mitigate that, putting in the market measures. Then we had the tsunami, and then we had Fukushima earthquake that destroyed infrastructure. Then what the GVC did was they found a horizontal shift of activities that have other places that can mitigate this kind of shocks. The pandemic didn't destroy any infrastructure. It's only stopped the movement of people. So all the factories, all the activities are there from the supply side. But the disruptions are mostly in the demand side, which basically means warehousing, logistic. That part we didn't take into account. And that's where the GVC resilient collapsed. And the demand side of the resilient become very weak, because it's not that we are not increasing the supply. It's getting that supply to the people that the logistic component become very difficult for us. So warehousing, storage, distribution, retail logistic, those are the things that actually collapse significantly in terms of the GVC. So likely we're going to see a lot of technology kind of mitigate that aspect of the to make the GVC more resilient. Traditional services like tourism, logistic, aviation services completely collapsed, and also employment to skill resilient of the GVC is big. So when we see some aspect of the GVC collapse, certain skill sets you need to make it more stronger, especially technology. So the employment, the skill resilient of the value chain is big in terms of supporting the service linkages, moving goods from one place to the other. So I'm not going to talk on this one, but fairly I can tell you that the demand side is very weak. And with the higher inflation, with Russia-Ukraine war, rising cost of production, fairly the demand side, persistent of the weakness, the demand side is likely to persist, which means that without the demand side, we cannot sell the goods. So we are also monitoring the demand side, because inflation erodes the purchasing power of people, and people during inflation will prefer to, especially when the inflation is persistent, they will try to save more, I think. But at the same time, higher inflation now also means that people might consume. But fairly, the demand side is getting weaker and weaker. And as you can see, movement of people industry, tourism has collapsed. To the right-hand side, when there's a persistence of the virus, the number of people who can move actually falls. But this is also interesting. Even with the opening of the border and trying to revive the tourism sector, the costs at the border is still very high. At the border, like PCR tests and antigen tests, fairly we need to coordinate to remove most of them out. That will allow more movement of people. So when the border costs increase, only business people select to move. And the other behavioral dimension is when people move, they stay longer the other side before they come, because of the higher transaction costs. So which means that people will stay longer the other side. So you're not going to see multiple movement of people across the border, which means not like before in the pre-COVID, people used to go to work in KL, and then a few days later they come back. So now with a higher border cost, the PCR test and the paperwork and the transaction cost is very high. So when people move there, they go and stay there a bit longer before they come, which basically means a lot of border trading activities will fall. So that we need to keep in mind that if we can remove the PCR test and make it more rapid test, increase the level of vaccination and the therapies, then economic cooperation between regions become important to mitigate this, I think. Quickly, as I mentioned, employment skill resilient, fairly, you can see the wages has collapsed in some countries like Malaysia and Philippines, and wages are very difficult to recover, especially for older workers, unskilled, and you also see more gender effect on females. At the same time, we're also observing youth unemployment because of COVID. Those young, educated people entering the labor market, they become very vulnerable in the COVID itself. I'm not going to do this fairly. There are a lot of structural issues emerging in the labor market, and that will be important to see. Poverty has increased significantly, and whatever poverty reduction, extreme hunger and so on, we eradicated the last 10 years because of liberalization will all already disappeared, and now the extreme poverty and extreme hunger has elevated to another higher stage, which means that a lot of people within countries, between countries, older people and more unskilled workers are become very, very vulnerable in this pandemic. Human capital is also been disrupted, so fairly we need to do more training, and this is going to be very fundamental for us to maintain the recovery dimension itself. So as I mentioned, these are the eradication of extreme hunger, poverty, and then you can see the COVID has actually increased. And industries that we are experiencing are all labor-intensive industries. I'm not going to do this, and I quickly will talk about, take the last few minutes to wrap up. One is early detection of the virus help us a lot. That's why level 4 is important. And a good example is when China observed its first case, fairly we didn't react to that. We had like 4 months to actually react. We didn't react. So in the future, we need a stronger pandemic policy, monitoring and evaluation policy that that signal us early enough to manage the movement of people issue. And again, we need to understand the level of protection. This is again been confusing for a lot of people, and fairly this kind of information to be given to people to educate them. And as I can see, Singapore is doing very, very well. And then fairly, I hope that we go for the 4th dose soon. I think my mother-in-law and my mother has received the letter for a 4th dose in Singapore. So issues like flattening the curve is becoming important, but now we fairly have given up this flattening of the curve, and zero COVID case is going to be very difficult to achieve because it's a living organism. Living organism is very difficult to have a zero COVID case. But fairly what we need is to maintain a certain level, flatten the curve. But the other part is looking at fertility and the and how our healthcare infrastructure is not overwhelmed. And those are important because during the COVID, a lot of resources will move into managing the COVID cases. And the other cases, chronic cases, we didn't put in enough resources. Again, more death, more negative externality came from the COVID itself. Okay, so how do we going to manage this? Fairly, we still go with the vaccination travel lanes called bubbles, and sequencing is important, and that's exactly what we're doing. And identify cities, and city-to-city connectivity is the way to open up and manage the movement between cities. That will still be ongoing, I think. Fairly, the higher vaccination rate, the contagion been contained. Fairly, we can see more movement of people. Social distancing is being reduced, and that is again important. Healthcare, we need more subsidies and testing, improve healthcare infrastructure. I think we still need to give more cash transfers. The reason is, and support more poorer households, poorer kids in terms of meals and so on, because it affects their level of education. So these are hidden components in urban centers. And in rural centers is very visible, but urban centers is all hidden. So this becomes very important, how to observe these hidden social issues. Wage subsidies might be important. So let me stop here, and then I'm happy to take one or two questions. Okay, so there's a question on why do we see interest rate in ASEAN going? What will be the major implication to the economies? Well, the Federal Reserve is planning to increase interest rate because there's so much liquidity has already been pumped in for the last 2 years. So they have to mop up some of the liquidity itself. So, and that liquidity is being translated into inflation itself. So fairly, inflation is coming through the collapse of the demand side of the GVC, the logistic and so on. Prices are moving up. At the same time, there is some concern about too much liquidity in the system. So interest rate is still expected to go up and in the second half. And we are in a challenging position because inflation is going up. We're seeing some recovery. And the only thing we are worried that we will not have a stagflation. So a stagflation is when we see inflation and unemployment occurring at the same time. And we are quite worried about that aspect itself. And food prices, how should government help its citizen? Fairly, this is an interesting question. One way the government need to keep tab of the price increases. For Singapore's case, fairly, we have a good distributional system. So there's two aspects to food price increase. One is the actual food price increase. The other is the distributional cost increase. So fairly, most of the case, the distributional cost adds the price. The moving goods from point A to point B adds a lot of impact to the price increase. So if you can keep the distributional cost less, that's the job of NTUC. And then we have Sheng Siong and Giant in Singapore. So the procurement and able to keep the distributional cost lower will allow us to maintain the price lower, especially the essential goods. And that is the objective of NTUC itself, to keep the price lower and able to hedge price increases. Hedging means looking for alternative commodities so that can hedge the price. That becomes a very important component. It's not just the increase in food production, but the distributional part is where we can keep the price lower. That becomes an important dimension in managing a price increase. Second is, I still believe subsidies, food subsidies should be given. And I think you are working on some kind of cash transfers through coupons and so on, so that people still can go out and buy commodities, essential goods, especially for vulnerable population. So more coupons, food coupons should be given to poorer people, older people. Those are important. But keeping in mind, in this pandemic, the middle income is squeezed a lot extremely a lot with digitalization, with paying higher tax, direct, indirect tax. So we also need to think how to help the middle income because they are the one who keep the buoyancy of the economy intact. Those things will be important in terms of managing the price, especially the distributional costs of food prices. So it's not actual increase in price, it's how people move goods from point A to point B. So when you have multiple people moving, then they increase the price in times 3, the 3 people move. So the distributional cost is the one who adds a lot to food prices and inflation itself. Okay, so those are the questions I have. If there is no question, I will pass this back to Jenny. Jenny, to you, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Professor Shandre, for the informative sharing. Hi, everyone. This is Jenny from Ngee Academy. Our academy is very happy to be able to attend this event to share with everyone our Adelaide MBA program. Please allow me to share my screen. Okay, I hope everyone can see my screen. So basically, we are from Ngee Academy. We are the only academy in Singapore that's actually providing this Adelaide MBA program. So Adelaide is the only university in Singapore that's affiliated under the Group of 8 Australia. And the program is actually accredited by the Association of Advanced College School of Business and is ranked 5-star GMAA from the Graduate Management Association of Australia. It's ranked the top 1% of university worldwide too, and it's the top 2 MBA programs that you can find in Australia. Most importantly, that the whole program is fully delivered by the University of Adelaide faculty. Yeah. So by the end of this program, our students will be inculcated with the set of skill sets and values, which include the following. So you will be basically able to establish, grow, and develop personal and professional relationship that will definitely have a lasting impact on your professional career. You'll be able to gain first-hand experience in advanced analytical problem solving and critical thinking skills that are critical to your ongoing growth and development in either your personal or your career growth. You'll be able to develop strong leadership skills that will allow you to actually drive innovation, creativity, and positive changes within your organization. You will also learn how to actually cultivate a global outlook and foster a strategic mindset that allows you to see a bigger picture of the current business world and make tactical decisions confidently and understand the management of critical business functions and their impacts in areas such as finance, accounting, economics, and marketing. So if you are actually looking for strong credentials to expand your knowledge, as well as improve your chance for future entrepreneurial or career success, then Adelaide MBA is definitely tailor-made for your needs. You can actually follow us at Ngee Academy, either on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or even on our website, naa.edu.sg, or you can actually direct contact me on my mobile, 94571271, or my email. Yeah, so we have reached the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Prof. Shandre, for your sharing and for your time today. We hope you've enjoyed today's session and will now invite you to participate in our feedback poll. Please give us your honest feedback so that we can further improve on our brown bag series. The feedback poll should be popping up on your screen, so please take a few moments to share with us your observations. Thank you very much for your feedback and for joining us today. This Brown Bag session is proudly brought to you by HeadHunt in partnership with Ngee Academy. Our next session will be next Tuesday, 19th of April, and the topic will be Sustainable Eating for Future Singapore. It will be brought to you by James Cook University. So please sign up early on our website, masterclass.sg. With that, we will end today's session. We wish you a wonderful long weekend ahead and goodbye.